Greetings, scholars, for AP Euro History. Here's our last review here, looking at Unit 13 on page 68. Some thoughts here on question 1. Compare and contrast the political and economic policies of Joseph Stalin in the period before the Second World War and those of Mikhail Gorbachev from 1985 to 1991. In 1953, Stalin died, followed by Nikita Khrushchev. And Khrushchev is famous for his secret speech in which he denounced the crimes of Stalin against socialism. And one of Khrushchev's goals was to increase the amount of consumer goods that were available and to make life better for the Soviet citizens materially. Yet the Soviet system continued to run gulags, was oppressive, denied human rights, individual freedoms, and emphasis remained on heavy industry to the detriment of the production of consumer goods, with constant shortages, constant lines, and housing shortages. Brezhnev, who followed Khrushchev, reacted to Khrushchev's humiliation over the Cuban Missile Crisis by tightening the bureaucracy and increasing anti-Semitism and harassment of Jews and cracking down on dissidents such as Andrei Sakharov. Afghanistan's invaded in 1979, and Chechnya, a rebel Muslim province of Russia, continued to demoralize the USSR. Gorbachev comes to power in 1985, and he institutes glasnost and perestroika. Remember, glasnost is political openness, and perestroika is economic restructuring. Soviet Eastern European satellites are permitted to rebel and to throw off their communist systems. And in 1990, Lithuania, one of the Soviet Union's republics, declares independence from the USSR, and by 1991, all of the Soviet republics secede, pull out of the Soviet Union. The arms race with the West had caused economic suffering. Gorbachev does sign the INF and the START treaties, and the Helsinki Accords, signed by Brezhnev, created a standard for dissidents to hold the Soviet II later as Gorbachev is loosening up. So the big picture here is Stalin sees, the Stalin years see political oppression, see gulags, see the arrests and the murder of many millions of Russians. Think of the purges. Think of the tens of millions who are going to die in the Stalin years, compared with Gorbachev, who's loosening up, who's relaxing the power of the state over free speech and over Gorbachev is going to loosen up on the, he's going to allow more economic freedom. And maybe a sort of a synthesis thing here is to maybe compare the new economic policy of Lenin with the perestroika of Mikhail Gorbachev. Only under Mikhail Gorbachev the whole system is going to implode and collapse. Question 2, considering the period 1953 to 1991, analyze the problems within the Soviet Union that contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet system. Well, think of the things above here in question 1, but the Soviet citizens under communism suffered from a lack of democracy, no legal rights, no freedom of religion, no freedom of the press, no freedom of speech, no freedom of assembly, no freedom to travel within the USSR or outside. There was a severe and constant lack of consumer goods, such as housing, food, cars, appliances, clothes. There's the persecution of nationalism in the republics under Stalin, and later any nationalism that threatened Soviet control. You had the international embarrassment of jailing dissidents like Sakharov and booting, Solzhenitsyn got booted out in 1975, and you had the persecution of Jews, a lot of anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. You had the loss of the war in Afghanistan and this continuing conflict in the rebel breakaway republic of Chechnya. You had disillusionment with the cost of the war. The war in Afghanistan weakened the will of the Soviets to maintain their grip on Eastern Europe and to be involved in overseas escapades. The policies of Gorbachev, of perestroika and glasnost, encouraged independent behavior. Gorbachev famously did not crack down on a coal miners' strike. Gorbachev allowed the outer empire of Eastern European nations their freedom from communism, which inspired Lithuania and later other inner empire republics to do the same. All right, questions 3 through 5, all similar questions on decolonization. What led to the decolonization of this vast overseas empire that the Europeans had picked up at the end of the 1800s? Well, at the end of World War II, a number of things are going to change. One, effects of World War II. Wartime weakened overseas control, and the Nazis are busy occupying Western Europe, sort of cutting off a certain amount of access to overseas colonies, allowing indigenous groups to rise up and begin to organize independence movements. There's the need after the war to focus on rebuilding Europe. World War II's allied principles of self-control and democracy are basically turned back on the Europeans. And the Japanese defeat of Europeans in Asia inspired independence movements to do the same. International pressure by the U.S. during the Cold War to allow freedom. The U.S. had no colonies, and colonialism made democracy look bad and communism like liberation. So there isn't American support for the big picture is not American support, although Americans do support the French in Indochina for a number of years. There's the eclipse of European power in the 1956 Suez Crisis. Remember the Brits, the French, the Israelis. There's going to be this attack on the Suez Canal, which is nationalized by Nasser. And at the end of this crisis, the Americans basically yank the chain on the Europeans and order them out here. And it shows that Europe is incapable of independent, sustained overseas action without American help and without American approval. And the USSR and China both are in support of rebellions, providing material support for rebellion against European rule. You have the fall of Eastern European communism. Yes, this could be discussed. You could argue that the Red Army's control of this outer empire is akin to colonization or imperialism of a sort. See the notes on the questions on the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. New intellectual currents. Europe had educated many indigenous leaders, such as Gandhi of India. You have new attitudes that are favorable to independence, this greater self-awareness and self-criticism of overseas colonization, especially after fighting a long war against Hitler and Mussolini. You have the loss of European self-confidence, and you've got the democratization of Europe. For example, in Portugal, is in 1974 throws off the final dictator of Caetano, which follows this long dictatorship of Salazar. The Portuguese very quickly are going to give freedom to Angola and to Mozambique. And you have colonial resistance. You have warfare, for example, Algeria, long bloody war between the Algerian rebels and the what are called the Pied Noirs. These are the Blackfeet. These are the French settlers in Algeria, and there's going to be a successful independence movement in Algeria, as there's going to be in places like Vietnam and Kenya and Indonesia and Angola and Mozambique. There's going to be successful fights by the natives, quote unquote. You have passive resistance in India, and you have under Mohandas Gandhi, you have this nonviolent civil disobedience against the Brits, which proves ultimately to be effective. So a lot of things are leading to this collapse of this huge overseas empire and the liberation of large swaths of Africa and Asia from European rule. Question 6 here on page 69. Many historians have suggested that since 1945, nationalism had been on the decline in Europe. Using both political and economic examples from the period 45 to 2000, evaluate the validity of this interpretation. Well, you could talk about the disintegration of Soviet control over Eastern Europe immediately after Gorbachev allowed freedom. Especially important was the Polish Pope's visit to Poland and the 1989 fall of the Berlin Wall. You could discuss how all 15 republics seceded from the USSR, And you can discuss the continuing war against Muslim Chechnya, this rebel breakaway region of Russia. You could discuss the civil war in Yugoslavia from 1991 to 99 under Serbian demagogue Slobodan Milosevic, and how the first Yugoslav republic to secede was Slovenia, followed by Croatia, which led to war and mutual ethnic expulsions. Especially brutal was joint aggression against Bosnian independence by Serbia and Croatia, leading to approximately 70,000 dead, hundreds of thousands of refugees, mass rapes as an instrument of terror by Serbian paramilitaries. Finally, Macedonia and Montenegro also declared independence. 1998 through 1999, the southern Serbian-controlled province of Kosovo declared independence. The Kosovars were Muslim in religion and Albanian in language. Milosevic attacked Kosovo, killing approximately 10,000 and sending in 900,000 refugees into flight into Albania. This ended with NATO air attacks on Belgrade. Question 7. Analyze factors working for and against European unity from 1945 to 2001. As far as disunity, basically you can talk about incidents in the Cold War in Europe. Now this could, from one perspective, could be discussing unity of the Western Europeans in the face of Soviets' control of Eastern Europe, but you can also talk about just this division, this divide of Europe into these two camps. So you can discuss the Cold War, imposition of communism on Eastern Europe by the Red Army. You can discuss communist parties in Italy and France and how the U.S. Marshall Plan is put into place to retard the attraction of communism, especially after post-war years of poverty, hunger, and unemployment in Europe. And keep in mind the Marshall Plan's official name is the European Recovery Act. You have the creation of West Germany and communist East Germany, these two opposing camps in Germany controlled by the West and East Germany by the Soviets. You have the USSR's invasions of Hungary in '56 and Czechoslovakia in '68 to stop liberalization. And this brings into focus what's called the Brezhnev Doctrine. The Brezhnev Doctrine is Brezhnev's statement that guarantees Soviet protection of communist states from capitalist rebellion. And sorry this isn't in sequence here. In 1948 you have the Berlin blockade and airlift. In 1961 you have the Berlin Wall is built. Keep in mind these are separated by several decades. The Berlin blockade and airlift is in the 40s. In the 60s you have the Berlin Wall. Post-communism, you could talk about the European sovereign debt crisis, the question of a German and Northern European bailout of Greece. You could talk about the pigs here, the Portuguese, the Irish, the Italians, the Greeks, and the Spanish, these states that are unstable, basically, living off of a lot of loans from Northern Europe and how this is destabilizing currently the European Union. You could talk about opposition to the European Union and limits on national sovereignty, such as the Brexit from a summer ago. As far as unity, you have the Marshall Plan helping to revive the economies of Western Europe. You have NATO providing a military umbrella for Western European revival. And then you have the ECSC, the European Coal and Steel Community, is becoming the basis of the EEC. In your book it says ECC, that's a typo. It should be the European Economic Community, which is going to evolve into the EU, the European Union, and the creation of the euro as a common currency by the Maastricht Treaty. Good question here. 8, comparing the Allies' treatment of Germany after World War I and after World War II. After World War I, Germany is promised a peace without victory by Wilson's 14-point peace plan, but Britain and France wanted revenge. The Versailles Treaty imposed harsh terms, which is dictated. Germany is not present at the negotiations. The terms were humiliating, creating the conditions for unrest, for resentment, and the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. And Germany loses in this treaty Alsace-Lorraine, which they had originally taken from the French at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. You have the Saar and Ruhr coal mines are occupied by France. You have the Rhineland demilitarized and occupied by the French army. You have exclusion from the League of Nations. You have the loss of Silesia and Eastern Prussia to a new Polish state. You have the Polish corridor dividing Germany, and Danzig or Gdansk is run by the League of Nations. And you have the loss of all colonies, and you have the payment of billions in war reparations, and you have the War Guilt Clause 231. So you've got this long, long list of humiliations that the Germans are forced to sign in 1919 at the end of World War I. Fast forward after World War II, by the Soviets, East Germany is occupied. The German border is forcibly moved to towards the west. They're losing part of their eastern territory here, which is given to the Poles. The Russian army stays. Why is this all happening? Because the USSR wants Germany weak, no future German invasions after two that occurred in World War I and World War II. You have a Cold War division of Germany agreed to earlier in Yalta and the Potsdam conferences. Other allies, though, were more conciliatory and wanted a strong, self-sufficient Germany that was stable, democratic, and resistant to political turmoil and communism. You have the Marshall Plan helping to rebuild West Germany. And be sure to comment here that until 1948, there are three zones of occupation: the U.S., the French, and the British in West Germany, but these are joined to create the German Federal Republic, which is the Free Germany. NATO was set up as a Western military alliance, and the Germans are brought in as an anchor. And in 1948, an independent Germany with Bonn as its capital is created with a constitution and an independent currency. West Germany becomes free, prosperous, democratic, consumer goods oriented, unthreatening, and an economic miracle. Let's jump here to questions 15 through 17 here, and some thoughts here on the end of Soviet domination over Eastern Europe. There'll be a little repetition from some other questions here, but filling in the blanks here in our review book on page 73. After 1945, after World War II ends, you have Soviet rule in Eastern Europe under Stalin imposing one-party communist rule, totalitarian rule in Eastern Europe. You have the imposition of centralized communist economic policies, ideological indoctrination, and democracy and freedom were suppressed. You have the local communist governments are backed by the presence of the Red Army, and after 1989 you have the fall of the Berlin Wall, and Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and East Germany all reject communism. Mikhail Gorbachev allowed glasnost and perestroika in the USSR and refused to enforce the Brezhnev Doctrine in the Soviet satellites and neighboring nations. As far as Czechoslovakia, you have the Prague Spring, and this is socialism with a human face, an attempt to allow some free speech and travel and economic liberalization under Alexander Dubček. Dubček is D-U-B-C-E-K, until the Warsaw Pact invades and snuffs out the Prague Spring. The Brezhnev Doctrine is that the Soviets will not permit communist countries to rid themselves of communism. And once Czechoslovakia gets its independence, you have what's called the Velvet Divorce, and this is Slovak separation from the Czech Republic. And in 1989, in Czechoslovakia, you do have the election of Václav Havel as their first democratic president in a post-Soviet-controlled independent republic. As far as East Germany, you could talk here after the war about the Berlin blockade and airlift and the Berlin Wall being built in the 60s after 3 million fled from 49 to 61, a propaganda disaster for the Soviets. And eventually here you can talk about the 1990 unification of Germany. In Hungary, you've got the 56 Hungarian Revolution under Imre Nagy, N-A-G-Y, who allowed greater freedom until 100,000 Warsaw Pacts invade under Soviet direction. Cross out this thing here with Havel. That's Czechoslovakia, not under Hungary. In Poland in '56, you've got the Poznan unrest and riots. These are basically food riots showing discontent and unhappiness over the Soviet-backed government. 1980, you have the founding of Solidarity, and this is a trade union movement led by Lech Walesa. And you have the visit of a Polish pope that shakes the regime of General Jaruzelski. And in 1990, Lech Walesa becomes the first president of a free post-Cold War Poland. And this is happening before the Berlin Wall falls. So the Poles are successful in basically throwing off the yoke here. And this is the yoke of communism. This began because Gorbachev is loosening up. He's not insisting on the Brezhnev doctrine, keeping the Eastern republics under the Soviet boot. Okay, let's look at some comments here for questions. Our last unit, sort of the tail end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century. There's a question here contrasting European attitudes and policies about race at the end of the 19th century, the late 1800s, with those policies after 1950. Well, in the late 19th century, you have social Darwinism, the proponent Herbert Spencer, this idea of survival of the fittest applying to society. You have the scramble for Africa and overseas colonization. Remember, the scramble for Africa is what's discussed here at this meeting in 1885, the Berlin Conference, where the Europeans are literally dividing Africa on their maps. You have Rudyard Kipling's idea of the white man's burden. You have anti-Semitism is becoming not just a religious bias, but is backed by the pseudoscience of eugenics, which comes out of the idea of Darwinism. You have the Dreyfus Affair in France, and you got these guys, Arthur Gobineau and Houston Stewart Chamberlain are these famous anti-Semites, these anti-Semitic writers who long precede Adolf Hitler. You've got Theodor Herzl, H-E-R-Z-L, his call for Zionism, for Jews to go back to Palestine, to leave the discrimination in Europe. You're off task if you're talking about slavery and the slave trade here. That's much before the 1800s, and you'd also be off task on this particular question that's printed in the review book here, if you talk about Nazism, because that's not post-1950s. In talking about after 1950, you've got Charles de Gaulle, and flipping over to page 74, is going to allow a plebiscite in Algeria, and the Algerians will be allowed to get their independence after this long, prolonged civil war. And you have the flight of the Pied Noir. Remember the Pied Noir, these approximately 1 million French colonists in Algeria who are going to flee back to France. You've got the German invitation to the Turks to work as gastarbeiters. These are guest workers. You have French immigrants from North and West Africa and from Vietnam, and you have a certain amount of Arab immigration. In Britain, you have immigrants from the Caribbean, in India, and Africa. You have riots in the 1980s in British cities, and anti-Semitism is weakened in Europe after World War II, but you do have the rise of a neo-Nazi and skinhead movement, which are not just anti-Semitic, but anti-immigrant. Take a look here at question 4, a little bit similar here. Discuss political and economic effects of changing population patterns in Western Europe in the period circa 1950 to present. In Britain, again, you can talk about from the old empire, you have immigrants coming from India, Pakistan, and the Caribbean. In France, immigrants are coming from North and West Africa, and France getting the largest Muslim population in Europe currently. After the Algerian War for Independence, you have the flight of the Pied Noir back to France. Germany, again, you have the influx of gastarbeiters, these guest workers from Turkey, and they're going to be very instrumental in helping. Germany is missing a lot of men after World War II, and this is going to help with the 1950s German economic miracle. By 1950, Berlin is going to be the second largest Turkish city. So there's a lot of Turks in Germany. And you could also, this review book, I put this together before the Germans took in about a million of these Syrian refugees, but you could certainly put that in as well. That's definitely a current event that's relevant to this particular question. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Iron Curtain and communism, many Poles and East Germans went to Western Europe, especially Germany, to find jobs. And you have Chechens and other Caucasians, people from the Caucasus, going to Russia as immigrants. And you have, during the Yugoslav wars, and particularly the Bosnian Civil War, tens of thousands fled from Bosnia, also many Croats and Serbs. Hundreds of thousands of immigrants are fleeing during this war. You have what's called the browning of Europe, these immigrants who are coming, working for lower wages and longer hours. Europe's native white population is declining in 14 countries below the what would be the replacement rate, and this is politically explosive, giving rise to anti-immigrant populist parties. You have rising intolerance, racism, and xenophobia, and the rise of ultra-right nationalist and right-wing political parties, for example, the National Front in France under Jean-Marie Le Pen, and later his daughter Marine Le Pen. And as this is being filmed in May of 1917, Marine Le Pen just lost an election to Mr. Macron. She won about a third of the vote, but remember, her platform is essentially to expel the immigrants, to restrict immigration. And a lot of this is, picked up traction because of the mass murders, these terrorist attacks by Muslims in France, by Islamic jihadists, these extremists, the hijacking of trucks and mowing people down on sidewalks in the Riviera, the attack on the nightclub in France, the Charlie Hebdo offices getting attacked, and the French priest getting his throat slit, and just a lot. This seems like an endless onslaught of attacks by Muslim extremists in Europe. As far as feminism goes, depending on where we're starting, talking about women, if we're looking at the tail end of the 1800s, early 1900s, you have industrialization and urbanization. We're looking on page 74, question 5 and 6. You have women are working more cheaply in factories and in businesses, and poor families often needed extra income. So women are working. As far as technological changes, you have labor-saving devices allowing women to spend time outside of the home. You have appropriate work for women, and there's this phrase, the petite bourgeoisie. These are the sort of people at the bottom of the middle class, and jobs that are appropriate for women, for young women, that don't put them in proximity to men, that don't have them working in dangerous conditions, would be as telegraph operators, telephone operators, as typists, doing office work, as secretaries. Other nurturing work would be nursing, and as teachers. And keep in mind, you do have poor women are working in factories. Poor women are domestics. They're working as maids, and the very poorest of women are being forced into prostitution in these large European cities. As far as economic changes, increasing consumerism and materialism create a demand for goods, and a decline in agricultural income and movement to cities creates a need for women's income. As far as social change, during the wars, women, World War I and World War II, women took jobs of missing men in farms and in industry. Communism rejects the bourgeois social organization of the West that limited women's roles, and at least on paper, the new communist government after 1917 has given women the right to vote, the right to run for office, the right to enter universities, the right to have any jobs that a man can have, and the right to abortion and to contraception. So you have this sort of radical feminism compared to the rest of Western Europe. Remember Alexandra Kolontai, this feminist writer in the new Soviet Union, a defender of women's rights. Examples of independent women in Europe, and this is a little bit not random, but these are not necessarily connected to each other. You've got Florence Nightingale bringing nursing as a sort of a woman's profession, sort of concurrent with this. If you're doing some sort of synthetic synthesis, would be perhaps Clara Barton during the Civil War and the Red Cross and the bringing of women into the nursing profession there. You have Marie Curie, who is discovering the radioactive properties of radium. You have Marine Le Pen, currently running for the presidency of France. You have Simone de Beauvoir, this post-World War II feminist, in her book, The Second Sex, which she's essentially arguing that women need to control their reproduction, that you will not have equal rights with men unless you can figure out how not to bear children. She's an advocate of abortion and contraception and later marriages so that women will have the ability to compete with men for jobs and for social equality. And then again, you have Margaret Thatcher, who's the sort of the opposite of Clement Attlee, who's bringing democratic socialism to Great Britain after World War II. Thatcher is going to bring privatization to many of the iron mines or coal mines and steel mills, and she's going to privatize a lot of public housing. Her nickname here is the Iron Lady, a good friend of Ronald Reagan, a good opponent of communism. And compulsory education laws took children out of the workforce. As far as political and government policy changes, women after World War II in Europe are going to get the right to vote. There's going to be women's suffrage. There's going to be public education, including women. And post-World War II legislation will protect women's equality and with state-supported child care and maternity leave. And as far as health and medical changes, you have access in most of Western Europe and Eastern Europe for contraceptives, abortion. There's going to be fewer infant deaths leading to longer longevity. And the need for more income for women. And you have also the expansion of the social welfare state, which is going to help women through paid maternity leave and health care. Last question here to look at, question 7 here. This is analyze the factors that led to the expansion of the welfare state in Western Europe in the mid-20th century. And some thoughts here. The social welfare state, remember, this is where the government provides a lot of social services to their citizens. And one thing that will lead to the expansion of the welfare state is the allure of communism. Remember, after World War II, you have several years of suffering in Europe. You have huge unemployment, you've got devastation, you've got bad harvests, you've got just a lot of despair. And communism has a certain allure. The Soviet system has full employment. The Soviets have some street cred here. It's their army that largely destroyed the Nazis. And you have the growth of these large communist parties in Italy and in France. So to fight the allure of communism, you have the growth of social democratic policies, which are going to give a lot of the things that the communists promise. You have increased prosperity, which leads to the ability of the Europeans to provide things like health care and these social benefits like pensions and unemployment insurance. You have increased unionization. Keep in mind the Europeans are much more collective this way than Americans, so you have successful union organizing and the demand politically and the provision of social benefits. And you have greater democracies. People are voting democratically for things like old age pensions and health care and paid vacation leave and easier access to universities. You have two types of political parties. We have the social democratic socialist parties, for example, the Labour Party in Britain, and the Social Democratic Party in Germany is this long-standing socialist party. And these have a Marxist basis, but they're using the democratic system to provide these said social welfare benefits. And you have Christian democratic parties, and there's about a half a dozen countries in Europe that have a party that has a Catholic basis. Now, these are secular parties now, but they promote two things. One is democracy and social welfare. And under the Catholic Church, you have the promotion of political parties that will look to the vulnerable, look to children, look to women, look to the sick, look to the elderly to provide um, social welfare benefits. So here's some thoughts on the tail end of the review book here on what's going on after World War II. Be thinking about things that are creating division, things that are creating unity. Be looking at, reviewing the changing demographics of Europe and the relations within the southern zone of the EU with the northern zone, the sovereign debt crisis, and the problems of immigration, particularly from non-democratic countries in Africa and the Middle East, of different races, different religions, and how this is creating social tensions in Europe. So I'm making this review here for the day before the test. This is May 11th, and if you're watching this, if you have any questions, find me during lunch or after school, and I'll be happy to talk with you. So keep studying. Hang in there. Good luck. Bye.